Chapter 9. German Foreign Office Proper. In each of the rooms I entered to keep an appointment, a dignified figure rose from a large desk and came forward, and with traditional courtesy bowed and shook hands. That was the German Foreign Office at number 76 Wilhelmstrasse. Across the road from number 76 is number 63, von Ribbentrop's Foreign Affairs Office. I spent 2 mornings that week at the Foreign Office consulting various officials about a conference for educationalists, economists, and philosophers who were to meet in Berlin shortly afterwards in order to see if they could get at the more fundamental causes of this revolution. The attitude of some of these men was formal and entirely correct in relation to the German government. After all, they were government officials, and they were Germans, and any personal opinions they had must not be revealed to a stranger and a foreigner. They, no less than others, were anxious, very anxious, about the future of Europe. They did not put forward the more fantastic Nazi claims, but carefully and much more skillfully they indicated that the causes of unrest in Europe 20 years after the last war were not entirely Germany's fault. With people like those, it was well nigh impossible to know what they were really thinking, though all the time I was acutely aware that the whole Nazi idiom was foreign to them, even though they used it formally, and indeed gave the Nazi designs a less crude and much more subtle interpretation. Later that morning, another member of this office I was visiting shrugged his shoulders, and in a passing remark at once revealed his attitude. "You know, fevers must run their course, and the only thing for some of us to do is wait. You understand me." He went on to show how cleverly the Nazis were using certain national fears and sentiments. Take, for example, the fear of encirclement. People in your country are quite wrong in thinking that this is not a real fear in the mind of many Germans. Hitler knows better, and he uses this fear. You see, it is not that the Germans have a reasonable theory about encirclement that is based on facts, although this is partially true, because all our neighbors are so heavily armed. The much more dangerous thing is that facts like these can be highly colored, and they are presented to a people who do not think of a theory of encirclement, but are deeply conscious that one of the most bitter experiences of their lives was the 4 years of the last war, when in fact they were encircled by enemies. Herr von Friedland said, "But the relevance of their past experience to the present day is really a psychological relevance. Surely it is true that a fear very often begets the very thing it fears. There is no doubt at all that there is deep down in the minds of masses of my fellow countrymen an intense fear of encirclement and an intense fear of Russia. Hitler knows how to use both those fears, and by feeding them, he hopes to strengthen the people's belief in him and his party." "By the way," he said, "did you go to the Unter den Linden exhibition called Die Front?" "Yes," I said, "and I realized that much of that, especially the picture postcards, which were bought by the thousand, tends to increase this fear, and it is visited by crowds from all over Germany. And mind you," he added, "I would not be honest if I did not say that I also think there is an element of truth in their fears. So long as there are burning problems left in Europe from the last war, and so long as there is acute economic depression, there is always a possibility of war. And whereas I am convinced that the people of this country don't want war, I am equally sure that if they are encouraged to believe war is likely, they will give full backing to all preparations against a second defeat and blockade. Most certainly Nazi propaganda does prepare their minds by showing the vulnerability of the Reich." "But don't they see," I asked, "that if Hitler goes on doing things like walking into the Rhineland and Austria, he will certainly start a war sooner or later?" Herr von Friedland got up and wandered to the window. "I do not agree with the Nazis' attitude to the Treaty of Versailles," he continued, "although naturally I take a very different view of it from your countrymen. I think it is important that any treaty that aims at peace should be the kind of treaty that can still be taken seriously 20 years after it is signed. Some of the present generation in England, as well as in Germany, seemed to live uncomfortably with certain of the decisions of 1919. Walking back to his desk, Herr von Friedland did not sit down, but stood beside it, playing with his pen. "Of course," he continued, "the most important thing is the clever way in which Hitler understands the mind of the people. You saw his latest headline?" "No. Which one do you mean?" I asked. "Hitler liquidates Versailles," he replied. "Whatever you or I may think of that treaty, whatever history may later say of it, for us, as Germans, it does stand for defeat and distress, and in a curious way Hitler has made thousands of Germans feel that he has closed a most unhappy chapter." At this moment the door opened, and a junior secretary entered stiffly and announced that Herr von Friedland was expected for the conference in the minister's room. "Thank you. I'll come at once," Herr von Friedland replied. Then turning to me as the door closed on the secretary, he said, "I must go. I hope your conference with the Nazis is a success. Ask them all the questions you can, especially the sort that is difficult for Germans to ask them. But forgive me for warning you in your own expression to remember all the time that you are dealing with outsiders." It was during the next afternoon that I had perhaps the most interesting talk at the Foreign Office. A few minutes before 2:30, I was taken up to keep an appointment with Herr von Hildesheim. I had not met him for many years, although I had known him as long ago as 1913. Having exchanged greetings and inquiries about our two families and mutual friends, Herr von Hildesheim plunged straight in by saying, "So you have come over with your friends to try and understand the Third Reich. I can only tell you that when you do understand it, you will join with the rest of us in praying God there may be a Fourth Reich, and that as soon as possible." "Well, that's plain anyhow. It's rather a relief to know exactly what you think about it all," I replied. He laughed and said, "No, I'm afraid I cannot say exactly what I think, because that would not be possible in language fit for a lady, or indeed for this Foreign Office. Tell me," he continued, "what do you think of our ambassador to the court of St. James?" "Von Ribbentrop?" I said, laughing. "It's impossible to be polite about him." "Oh, please don't try," he replied. "We have a joke in England that will give you a fair idea. We now say that England can no longer be expected to believe Germany is short of raw material if she exports so much to other countries." Herr von Hildesheim laughed. "Yes, that just about describes him. He is certainly raw material right enough." When he was appointed to Great Britain, we felt that if he were given enough rope he would hang himself, but that he would at least close down his circus at number 63 before he went to London. Instead of that, he is obviously much more interested in it than anything else, including his job in England. The truth is that he is as uncomfortable at the court of St. James as he is among us at this office, and having found favor with Hitler, he sets up this upstart organization across the road, of which he has supreme control, and completely ignores us, although we are the Foreign Office. You realize that he sends his young agents all over the world to make muddier and muddles and difficulties, and we have to answer for them, and to pay for their ignorance and mischief, though we have no control at all over him or them. It is pretty monstrous that many of our men are being used for his propaganda, and all sorts of other things that are entirely alien to Foreign Office tradition. In this way, he makes the position of loyal consuls and ambassadors in other countries impossible, because he plants his young men there as his spies, and the unfortunate consuls have to take the blame for the activities of people who have been forced on them as members of their staffs. The really dangerous thing is that I am convinced that their ignorance and aggressiveness will end in war. The real international scene has changed from this Foreign Office to von Ribbentrop and his gangsters. We are now a kind of international museum, but action and decision are in the control of the men across the road." "What you say of the Foreign Office and von Ribbentrop's office," I interrupted, "is really only one of the examples of the kind of split there is between state and party in many spheres of national life, isn't it?" "You are right," he replied, "but in foreign affairs it is a specially dangerous thing to have this division, although I must say it is pretty bad everywhere, for instance, in our law courts." The Nazis have created a system, a language, and a code. I was going to say of honor. It would be better to say of dishonor, of their own, and you cannot cooperate if you recognize a different standard. You either go all in, or you remain all out. Here is a very interesting example of what I mean, the kind of current diplomatic language that the Nazis don't understand. I learned from some of those who are often with Hitler that one of the standing jokes of his immediate group is the translation of the phrase you often use, namely, "The British government takes a serious view of the situation." That apparently is always met with ribald laughter and sneers, and seems to them to mean precisely nothing. I gather that on one occasion someone present who knew better tried to suggest that in fact it did mean that the relations between the two countries had deteriorated, and that in itself was a very serious thing. This remark was met with further shrugs of the shoulder and laughs, and one particularly crude Nazi remarked, "Deteriorated relations mean nothing. We are only interested in action, and they are doing nothing, so that is all we care." "Herr von Hildesheim, may I ask you a question?" I said. "If you were the Prime Minister of England today, and wanted to preserve peace on honorable terms in Europe, what would you do?" Without any hesitation he replied, "Arm like hell and break through all traditions in order to deal with the people who count. Let me explain. I think it is quite useless to deal with Nazis unless they know you are really strong and determined to fight if need be. At the same time, I do not think any of the slow roundabout diplomatic methods are getting anywhere. Neither the British nor the German foreign officials have got proper contact with Hitler and his gang. Whoever else tried might fail, but I would go on experimenting until I got someone who could break through the barrier. It might need to be someone with the technique and training of a psychologist rather than that of a civil servant." "May I ask one more question, which is closely related to that?" I said. "Do you think Hitler wants war? And in particular, do you think he wants war with England?" "I am glad you have asked that, because I would like to know what you think of my own impressions on that question. Remember that I am talking quite unofficially, and as I value my life, confidentially." "Does Hitler want war?" he repeated. "I am quite convinced that Hitler not only does not want war, but fears it more than anything else. At the same time, I am quite convinced that the way he expresses his fear through acts of aggression will make war inevitable in the end. I do not know how he may develop his visions. It is difficult to prophesy about the phases of so unstable a man, and one unlike most human beings, but I am convinced that his power over Germans is partly due to the fact he was passionately sincere in his desire to see Germany raised from desolation, and not because he or they wanted domination. Now, to achieve this, and not because he wanted other territory to begin with, he used such fantastic and dangerous methods that he immediately began to threaten neighboring states, and in fact to excite hostility and anxiety in the minds of all nations, including your own. That means that through his actions a fear of war became inevitable. He seems incapable of recognizing that he had created this situation, but as soon as he recognized it as a fact, he became frantic about the dangers of another war and blockade, and since then he has thrown his whole energy and all his vast machinery into preparations for war. I believe Hitler really wants to be friends with England more than anything, but he has not the slightest idea how to do it. Hitler does not know England nor the English language, and you know the type of men who are responsible for reading the English papers to him and how hopeless they are. Then you must add to that he depends on von Ribbentrop's advice, because he really thinks he knows England. There is no doubt that von Ribbentrop himself does not begin to understand England. For all that, if war comes, the nation will unite to begin with, and I think fight desperately, because we shall all be determined to avoid a second defeat at all costs. "I'm afraid I must go," I said, rising. "It all sounds rather dangerous." I was going to tea after this talk, but I found it too late. I walked along the Charlottenburg Gardens and thought about the discussions and the men I had met that long afternoon in the Foreign Office. I felt they were mostly honest and wanting peace, but their attitude seemed almost entirely negative and rather helpless. Compared with the vigorous sense of mission in von Ribbentrop's office, it did seem as though my friend was right when he said the Foreign Office was a kind of museum piece, and that all the real life and policy was made across the road. I wondered if we could do anything about dealing with this, for as I walked along the quiet corridors of that building that afternoon, and down the broad staircase where all moved slowly and ponderously, I felt tired and depressed, as though I had caught some of their helplessness and hopelessness.